The Abilene station in Kansas was a whirlpool of scorching heat and choking coal smoke. The year was 1878. Eleanor Vance stood on the wooden platform. The air tasted of grit and failed dreams. She smoothed the skirts of her simple blue travel dress. Her red shawl felt heavy and suffocating in the relentless midday sun. She clutched her worn carpet bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had traveled 3 days from the damp, cramped streets of Philadelphia. She had come to marry a man she only knew through ink and paper. She had never sent him a photograph. A tintype cost more than 2 weeks of mill wages, so she had done the only honest thing she could do. She had described the mark on her face in plain words. Mr. Silas Thorne was a wealthy cattleman. In his letters he had promised a life of stability. He had promised a home on the edge of the great American frontier. Eleanor knew she was no beauty. A dark, jagged birthmark marked the left side of her jaw. She had carried it since birth, like a secret the world refused to forgive. Her hands were rough from the textile mills, and her dress carried the dust of 3 hard days on the rails. But Silas had written that he wanted a plain, sturdy woman. He had written that beauty was a vanity he did not require. Eleanor had believed him. She had allowed herself to hope for a future where she wasn't a ghost. Now, she searched the crowd for a man with a silver-tipped cane. That was the signal they had agreed upon in their correspondence. She saw him near a waiting carriage. Silas Thorne was taller and more imposing than she expected. He wore a suit of fine black wool that cost more than she had earned in a year.
He looked like a man who commanded the very earth he walked upon. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked softly. Her voice was barely a whisper over the hiss of the steam engine. The man turned. He adjusted his spectacles and looked at her. He did not look at her eyes. He looked directly at the dark mark on her face. His expression shifted from curiosity to sharp, jagged revulsion.
He recoiled as if she were a ghost or a leper. "Good heavens," he muttered. The words felt like a physical blow to Eleanor's chest. "I am Eleanor Vance," she said, trying to keep her chin high. "I have the letters you sent, sir." Silas stepped back toward his polished carriage. He didn't even reach for her heavy bag. "There has been a terrible mistake," he said loudly. Several people on the platform turned to stare. "I asked for a plain woman," he said. "Not a woman with a devil's mark on her face." The heat of shame rose in Eleanor's neck. It was hotter and more painful than the Kansas sun. "I told you I was not fair of face, sir," she reminded him. "I told you I was a worker, not a parlor ornament." Silas let out a cold, mocking laugh. "I have a reputation in this town. I cannot have the neighbors whispering about my choice. I require a wife who can at least host a dinner without frightening the guests." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold coin. He dropped it onto the bench beside her, as if even handing it to her would soil his glove. "Take the next train back to the east. Consider it payment for your wasted time and my disappointment." He turned his back on her. He climbed into his carriage and signaled the driver. What happened at that station is shown only to reveal the cruelty of shallow judgment. This story does not glorify humiliation or hatred. The wheel ticked up a cloud of grit as he vanished down the main street. Eleanor stood frozen. The gold coin glinted in the dirt like a mocking, golden eye.
She did not pick it up. She would rather starve in the dirt than touch his charity. The platform began to empty as the train prepared to depart. The passengers moved toward the boarding houses and loud saloons. Eleanor felt the vastness of the prairie surrounding her. The prairie stretched so far it made her feel smaller than she had ever felt in her life. She was 1,000 miles from anything she knew. She had no money for a return ticket. She had no home to go back to, even if she did. A sob rose in her throat, but she choked it down with practiced iron.
She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing in this hard world. She looked at her reflection in a dusty window of the station office. She saw the ugly bride the town was already whispering about. She felt a shadow fall across her. A man was standing a few feet away. He was tall and lean, like a tree that had survived many storms. His clothes were covered in the fine gray dust of the trail. He held a battered Stetson hat against his chest. He looked like a man who had spent his life fighting the Kansas wind. Behind him, two small figures were peeking out from behind a wooden pillar.
They were two little girls, perhaps 5 years old. They had identical golden braids and matching soot-smudged faces. The man stepped closer. His boots made a slow, rhythmic thud on the dry planks. He had eyes the color of a winter sky after a long rain. They were tired eyes, but they held no cruelty and no pity. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a deep, low rumble that felt like thunder in the distance. Eleanor didn't look at him. "If you've come to laugh, please be quick about it," she said. Her voice trembled despite her best efforts to remain steady. The man didn't laugh. He stepped into her line of sight, blocking out the sun. "I saw what happened," he said quietly. "Silas Thorne is a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing." Eleanor finally looked up, meeting his steady gaze. "It doesn't change the fact that I am stranded and unwanted." The man looked back at his two daughters. The girls were watching Eleanor with wide, curious eyes. They didn't look afraid of the mark on her face.
They looked like they were waiting for a miracle to happen. "My name is Caleb Stone," the man said. He looked down at the hat in his hands, and for the first time, Eleanor noticed his fingers were trembling. "I run a small spread about 10 miles north of here. It's a hard life, and the house is far too quiet." He paused, twisting the brim of his hat in his rough hands. "My daughters, they lost their mother to the fever last winter. I'm a good worker, but I'm a poor hand at being a mother. Forgive me if this sounds too sudden," he said.
"I would not ask a stranger if I had another road left." He leaned in a little closer. He lowered his voice so only she could hear. "My twins need a mother, Miss Eleanor, and I reckon I need a reason to keep the fire going in that house." Eleanor stared at him, her breath hitching. "You don't even know me, Mr. Stone." "I know you stood your ground when that man insulted you," Caleb said. "I know you didn't pick up that coin."
"That tells me more than 100 letters ever could." The quieter of the two girls edged forward. She reached out and touched the soft fabric of Eleanor's red shawl. "You're pretty," the child whispered. Eleanor forgot how to breathe. No child had ever looked at her face without fear or confusion. For one impossible moment, she wondered if innocence could see a truth adults had spent a lifetime refusing to notice. "You look like the lady in Papa's picture books." Eleanor felt a sharp, agonizing pang in her heart. No one had ever called her pretty.
Not even her own mother, who had looked at her with mourning. "This isn't a fairy tale, Miss Eleanor," Caleb said. "It's cows and dirt and long, silent nights. But you'll have a roof and a name, and you'll have two girls who will love you if you let them." Eleanor looked at the empty tracks leading back to the cold east. Then she looked at the vast, open horizon of the west. She looked at Caleb's honest, weathered face. "I can cook," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I can mend. I can handle a plow if the season demands it." Caleb smiled for the first time. It was a small, weary smile that reached his eyes. "I don't need a plowman," he said. "I need you." He reached out his hand. It was a large hand, scarred by rope burns and years of hard labor. Eleanor took it. His grip was warm, steady, and certain. "Let's go home," he said. The wagon ride north was long and bumpy. The girls, Sarah and Martha, sat in the back. They chatted endlessly about wildflowers and meadowlarks.
Caleb drove the team in silence for a long time. The Kansas prairie stretched out like a golden, infinite sea. The tall grass moved in waves under the constant, singing wind. "It's a lonely place for some," Caleb finally said, "but it's a place where a person can start over. The land doesn't care what you look like. It only cares if you're willing to give it your sweat and your soul."
Eleanor watched the sun begin to dip toward the horizon. The sky turned a bruised purple and a burning orange. She felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being judged by a mirror. They reached the stone ranch just as the first stars appeared. The house was small, built of sod and timber. It looked lonely against the vast, darkening plain. Inside, the air smelled of cold ash and old, settled dust. It was clearly a house that had long been without a woman's touch. There were piles of laundry in the corner.
The dishes on the table were chipped, gray, and dirty. Caleb looked embarrassed in the dim lantern light. "I told you I wasn't much good at the house part," he said. Eleanor didn't say a word. She took off her red shawl and folded it neatly. She rolled up her sleeves with a look of determination. "Mr. Stone, find me some fresh water and a broom," she said. She worked until the table showed its grain again. The floor smelled of clean pine, and the stove burned bright. By midnight, the little house no longer felt abandoned. It felt like someone had chosen to stay. Sarah and Martha had fallen asleep on a small cot in the corner. Caleb sat by the fire, watching Eleanor with quiet awe. "You don't have to do it all tonight," he said. "I've spent years doing things when people told me I couldn't," she replied. "Working is how I know I'm alive and relevant." She sat down across from him. The firelight softened the lines of her face and the mark on her jaw. "Why did you really pick me, Caleb?" she asked. "There were other women at that station." Caleb leaned back, his eyes reflecting the flames. "I was there to post a notice for a housekeeper," he admitted. "But when I saw you standing there, you looked like a woman who had been through a storm. I've been through a storm too. I figured two people who survived the wind might be able to lean on each other." He stood up and walked to a small, dusty shelf. He picked up a tintype photograph. He handed it to Eleanor with a steady hand. It was a woman with a delicate face and sad, fragile eyes.
"That was Mary," he said. "She was beautiful, like a porcelain doll. But the prairie broke her heart and her spirit. She hated the wind. She hated the crushing silence. She gave up long before the fever finally took her." He looked Eleanor directly in the eyes. "I don't need a doll, Eleanor. I need a partner who can stand when the world shakes." Eleanor looked at the photo, then at her own rough, capable hands. She realized that beauty could be a heavy, fragile burden. It could be a thing that shattered in the wild. She was not fragile. She was iron. The next month was a whirlwind of labor and learning. Eleanor transformed the ranch with her bare hands. She planted a small garden near the well. She taught the girls their letters using a charred stick on the floor. At night, she tucked them beneath the quilt and told them stories about brave girls who crossed rivers, storms, and lonely roads. Sarah always fell asleep first. Martha always held Eleanor's hand a little longer. She learned how to milk a cow and how to spot a rattlesnake in the grass. The neighbors began to notice the change. In the frontier, gossip traveled faster than the telegraph. They spoke of the scarred woman Caleb Stone had brought home. Some women in town turned their heads when she passed. But the men looked at Caleb's well-fed daughters and his clean shirts. They looked at the way his fences were mended and his garden grew. They began to respect the silent work of her hands. Then, just as peace began to feel possible, the past came riding up the road. One afternoon, while Caleb was out moving the herd, a carriage arrived. It was the fine black carriage Eleanor remembered from the station. Silas Thorne stepped out, looking out of place in the dust. He looked around the yard with a condescending, narrow smirk. Eleanor stood on the porch, holding a heavy bucket of water. "What do you want, Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice like flint. Silas adjusted his silk cravat.
I heard you were still in the territory, he said. I heard you were living here in this sod hovel. He looked at the sturdy walls with deep disgust. My last housekeeper left without notice, he continued. They were all too flighty and demanding. Then I remembered you. A woman in your position might understand gratitude better than pride. I am prepared to offer you a position as my head cook. You will have a room in the main house and a decent wage. It's better than living in the dirt with a dirt grubber like Stone. Eleanor felt a cold, righteous anger rising in her. It was a clean, sharp anger she had never felt before. You think I would work for you? She asked. After you threw a coin at my feet like I was a stray dog? Silas laughed, a hollow and cruel sound. Don't be dramatic, woman. Look at yourself in a mirror. You belong in a kitchen where people don't have to look at you. Caleb Stone is only using you until he finds someone better. A man like him doesn't want a face like yours forever. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of hoofbeats thundered. Caleb rode into the yard on his powerful bay gelding. He dismounted before the horse had even come to a stop. He walked straight to the porch, his face a mask of iron. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at Eleanor. "Is this man bothering you, Eleanor?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it held the edge of a sharpened blade. Silas stiffened, trying to maintain his dignity. "I was making her a generous offer, Stone. She's wasting her time in this wasteland." Caleb turned to Silas. He didn't pull a gun or raise his fist. He simply stepped into Silas's personal space, towering over him. "This woman is not a servant," Caleb said. "She is the heart and soul of this ranch, and if she will still have me, she is the woman I intend to marry." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching. They had never spoken of marriage since that first day. "You're marrying that?" Silas sneered, pointing a gloved finger. Caleb smiled, and this time it wasn't weary at all. It was proud, fierce, and defiant. "I'm marrying the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever met. Now, get off my land before I forget my manners." Silas saw the lethal look in Caleb's eyes. He saw the way Eleanor stood beside him, unbowed. He realized he had no power in this place of truth. He climbed back into his carriage and lashed the horses. He fled back toward Abilene, swallowed by the same dust he had once thrown at her. That evening, after the girls had fallen asleep, Caleb found Eleanor on the porch. The prairie was quiet, and the first stars trembled above the roofline. He held his mother's ring in his palm. "I spoke too soon today," he said softly. "But I did not speak falsely." He looked at her with steady eyes. "Eleanor, will you marry me? Not because my girls need you, not because this house needs you, but because I do. If you are enjoying this story of love and resilience, please subscribe. Your support helps us bring more of these forgotten frontier tales to life. Comment below with the word strength if you believe Eleanor found her true home. The wedding took place a week later. It wasn't in a grand, cold church in the city. It was held in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree by the creek. Eleanor wore the blue dress she had arrived in. She had washed it until it shone like the morning sky. She wore her red shawl over her shoulders. The preacher from town said the ancient, holy words. Caleb's hands were steady as he placed a simple gold band on her finger. It wasn't a fancy ring with diamonds. It was thin, worn, and smooth. "It was my mother's," Caleb whispered. "She was a woman of the trail, too. She would have loved you for your spirit." As the sun set, the small family sat on the porch. Martha crawled into Eleanor's lap and whispered, "Are you truly our mama now?" Eleanor kissed the top of her head. "If your heart says I am," she whispered, "then I am." The twins were playing with a litter of kittens in the tall grass. The air was cooling, and the scent of wild sage was thick.
"Do you miss Philadelphia?" Caleb asked. Eleanor thought of the gray walls of the mill and the lonely streets. She thought of the thousands of faces that had looked away from her. "No," she said. "I was a ghost there, invisible and broken. Here, I am a woman." But the frontier was never easy for long. The winter of 1878 arrived with a legendary fury. The great blizzard hit in late December, blinding the world. The wind screamed across the plains like a dying, vengeful beast. Snow piled up against the sod walls until the windows were covered. Caleb was out in the barn when the storm hit its peak. He was trying to secure the frightened cattle. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than an hour. Eleanor watched the door, her heart sinking into her boots. The twins huddled by the stove, shivering. "Is Papa coming back?" Sarah asked, her voice small and brittle. Eleanor knew the terminal danger of a Kansas whiteout. Men died feet away from their own front doors in storms like this. They got turned around in the blinding white void. They froze in sight of their own rising smoke. "Stay here," Eleanor commanded the girls. "Do not open this door unless I tell you." She grabbed a coil of heavy rope from the larder. She tied one end to the heavy iron handle of the front door. She tied the other end tightly around her own waist. She wrapped her red shawl tight and stepped into the white abyss. The wind hit her like a physical wall of ice. She couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. The snow was like needles against her skin. She followed the rope, hand over hand, toward the barn. She found Caleb collapsed near the fence line. He had tripped over a frozen, hidden drift. His boots were encased in solid ice. He was shivering violently, his eyes glazed with the sleep of death. "Caleb," she screamed over the howling wind. He didn't answer, his spirit fading. Eleanor grabbed him under his arms. She could not lift him. No woman could have carried a grown man through that storm. So she did what the prairie had taught her to do. She tied the rope beneath his arms, braced her boots in the snow, and dragged him one painful foot at a time. The rope was her only lifeline in a world without color. Her fingers went numb. Her breath came in broken gasps. Twice she fell to her knees. Each time, she saw Sarah and Martha by the stove, waiting for a father who might not return. The wind tried to tear her away and scatter her. The cold tried to put her to sleep in the snow. But she thought of the girls waiting by the stove. She thought of the life she had finally found and would not lose. She reached the door and dragged Caleb inside with a final surge of strength. She slammed the door and barred it against the beast. She spent the night stoking the fire and rubbing his frozen limbs. She wrapped him in blankets, pressed warm cloths to his hands, and kept the fire alive until dawn. When the sun rose and were over blinding, silent white, Caleb opened his eyes. He looked at Eleanor, who was exhausted and soot-stained. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice a ghost of itself. His trembling hand found hers beneath the quilt. He held it as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. "I told you," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "I'm a worker." Caleb reached up and touched the scar on her face. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," he said. And for the first time, he saw her weep with joy. In the silence of the snow-covered prairie, Eleanor finally believed him. She realized that her mark was not a curse, but a testament. It was the mark of a survivor. The years that followed were kind to the Stone family. The ranch grew as the railroad expanded across the plains. Abilene became a bustling, civilized hub of trade. As for Silas Thorne, time humbled him in ways no sermon ever could. His name faded. Eleanor's did not. But the Stones thrived because they were built on solid ground. Eleanor and Caleb had a son 2 years after the Great Storm. They named him Adam for a new beginning. The twins grew into strong, capable young women. They didn't care about the shallow fashions of the East.
They cared about the land and the legacy their mother had built.
Eleanor's face never changed. The mark remained, a map of her long and difficult journey. But when people looked at her, they didn't see an ugly bride. They saw the woman who had saved the stone ranch. They saw the woman who could heal a sick calf or bake the best bread in the county. They saw a pillar of the community, standing tall and proud. One evening, many years later, Eleanor sat on the porch. Her hair was now streaked with silver, like the prairie moon. Caleb sat beside her, his hand firmly in hers.
They watched their grandkids playing in the tall grass. The Kansas wind was blowing softly, a lullaby this time. "Do you remember the day at the station?" Caleb asked. Eleanor smiled, the memory clear and sharp. "I remember the smell of the coal smoke and the fear, and I remember a man who whispered to a stranger." Caleb squeezed her hand with a love that had never faded. "I was the lucky one that day," he said. "I found the only woman in Kansas who was strong enough to love me." Eleanor looked out at the golden horizon. She often thought of women who had been made to feel small. If she could speak to them, she would tell them this. She wished she could tell them that the right person doesn't look at the face. They look at the soul, the part that never ages. Sometimes, rejection is the greatest gift you can ever receive. It clears the path for the people who truly deserve your heart. Eleanor Vance had come to Kansas to be a wife to a rich man. Instead, she became the heart of a real, living family. She had found a love that was as vast and enduring as the prairie itself, and that was more than any beauty could ever buy in this world.
True dignity is not found in a mirror. It is found in the work of our hands and the loyalty of our hearts. It is found in the moments when we choose to stay when others run. Eleanor Vance was no longer the girl from Philadelphia. She became the queen of the prairie, not because anyone gave her a crown, but because love finally gave her a home. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and hit the bell. It helps us continue to share these powerful stories of the Old West. What did you think of Eleanor's bravery during the blizzard? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
Thank you for staying with us until the end of this journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and hit the bell. What did you think of Eleanor's bravery during the blizzard? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.